Good evening. My name is Andrew Natsios, and I'm the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs and professor in the Bush School of Government. Before I welcome you formally, I just want to make two announcements. This is the first time we've announced these two events that are upcoming. November 15th, Carla Hills, Ambassador Carla Hills, who was the U.S. trade representative under President Bush 41, our President Bush, who negotiated the NAFTA trade agreement, will be here to speak, and there will be a panel of experts after she gives her address on November 15th. So November 15th, around 5:30, we'll be making announcements and sending flyers out. And then on November 27th, Professor Jeff Engel, who actually was one of my predecessors as the director of the Scowcroft Institute, he is now, SMU stole him from us. He is now a professor of political science at Southern Methodist University and the head of the Presidential History Center, I believe it's called. He has just written a long book, the definitive book on the Bush presidency, Bush 41 presidency, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restructuring of the world order. It is a historic book. I don't mean just a historical book, a historic book. And it will remake people's image, not our image, but the world's image of George Bush and his presidency. He will be speaking the week his new book comes out, which is at late November, and he will be speaking November 27th, also late in the afternoon. We will also get announcements out about that event as well. Welcome to the Conference on the Future of Iraq, Stability, the U.S. Role, and the Defeat of ISIS, which is the focus of a new Atlantic Council Task Force report on Iraq. This is a timely issue as President Trump has modestly increased the number of U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria to defeat ISIS, and so that we now have between 5,000 and 6,000 troops in just Iraq. It has been 16 years since U.S. troops removed Saddam Hussein in 2003, and the country, and the region continued to be a focus of U.S. strategic interest. It does continue to be one of the most unstable regions of the world. The United States Agency for International Development, which I served as administrator of during the first 5 years of the Bush 43 presidency, continues to provide humanitarian assistance to the 11 million people, almost half of Iraq, that is either displaced or suffering from the war going on there now. I'm just going to tell one story from, because AID was involved in the reconstruction of Iraq, and there was no internet in Iraq except for the senior leadership of Saddam Hussein's government. People didn't even know it existed, and so AID introduced the internet into every city hall, every school, and all of the universities. We built internet cafes. And we also stocked the libraries. There are no books in the libraries except Ba'athist propaganda. The medical journals were 40 years old in the Iraqi medical universities, medical schools. And so I was down in a village of about 10,000 people north of Basra, which is the largest Shia city in the south in Iraq. And I was in a city hall, and I went in, and there was this older gentleman with a long beard, and he was a school teacher. And I went up to him, and he was reading from the computers that we installed all the Arab newspapers. And I went up to him, and I introduced myself to him, and he said, we all know what AID is, and the U.S. government, thank you for this, this effort to bring the internet. He said, but we didn't even know this existed. He said, I read the Arab newspapers in Cairo and Damascus and all over the Arab world, and the American and European news every day now. I said, how could we have been denied this all these years? And he started to cry. I mean, literally, he was distraught that Iraq had been cut off from the world for so long. And we developed a linkages program between 12 Iraqi universities, 12 American universities, and 12 European universities. We chose them by competitive bidding. And we exchanged professors, because many of the Iraqi professors had never been allowed to leave Iraq. They didn't know what even other Arab countries were like. And we also stocked all the libraries, and we introduced curriculum, and it was a remarkable time. I know it was very controversial in some areas, but There are a lot of things the United States did, like restoring the Iraqi marshes. You may know that the Garden of Eden may well, according to biblical scholars, been the Iraqi marshes, which were desiccated, destroyed by Saddam. 92% of them were drained by Saddam. And it was the U.S. government working with the Marsh Arabs to restore the marshes and the economy of the marshes that brought them back to life again, and the fishing industry there. And it was a wonderful culture. And so there's a lot that is being lost in history, in my view. I wish someone would tell the real story of what happened. So while some negative things happen, some very good things happen. We have a group of experts this evening speaking who come from different backgrounds, and I will let Dr. Greg Gause introduce them. Dr. Gause, who's sitting at the far right here, my right, is the head of the International Affairs Department of the Bush School. He is too modest to say this, and I'm not exaggerating. He is one of the leading scholars in the United States, if not the West, on the Middle East. And he's called often by media all over the world. He is called by different federal agencies, some of which will remain unnamed, to get his opinion on what we should be doing or not doing. And so we have on our faculties, the head of our department, a leading expert. And he will introduce our speakers this evening. And then we will hear from Ambassador Crocker, one of my favorite diplomats and one of the most distinguished diplomats of the nation, who was ambassador to Iraq, along with many, many other positions he's held as a diplomat in the service of the United States. Welcome this evening.
Thank you, Andrew. Howdy. Howdy. That's what we do at Texas A&M. That's the way we start our events. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here. Before I do a very, very brief introduction of the panel, because you have their bios in the thing that you got, the program, that's what it's called. Let me just review how we're going to organize the evening. We're going to have a discussion among ourselves up here for about 40 minutes or so. At about the 30-minute mark, I'm going to ask the Bush School ambassadors, those sharp-looking young men and women with the blue blazers in the back, to distribute, at the 30-minute mark, to distribute index cards. If you have a question that you would like to ask of the panel, write it down on the cards, right? And in fact, I would ask them to distribute them now. I'll ask them about the 30-minute mark to come and collect them. And I'll just ask everybody to, on this side, pass to the center, right? On this side, pass to my right, your left. And on this side, pass into the center. Right? So at about the 30-minute mark, the ambassadors will come through to collect the cards. They'll bring them up to me, and I will speed read them and pick out the very best questions that you have submitted to ask the panel. At about the 1 hour mark, we're going to thank our panelists, and I'll ask Ambassador Crocker to join us. He and I will discuss the reflections of the other panel members. He'll give us his. And about 20 minutes into that, I'll ask the ambassadors to once again go through to collect the cards, and you'll have a chance to submit your questions to Ambassador Crocker, and we will wrap up here at 7:45, as we say in the Middle East, God willing. All right, there we go. A very brief introduction. Luqman Faili, on my immediate left, was the Iraqi ambassador to the United States from 2013 to 2016. Before that, he was the Iraqi ambassador to Japan, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to Texas A&M. Trudy Rubin writes the Worldview column in the Philadelphia Inquirer. She has been shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize more than once and has won numerous other awards for her international reporting and commentary. She's a longtime observer of the Middle East and of American foreign policy there. And this is the first time that she has ever been in Texas. I told you you'd get a whoop for that, right? On my far left is Dr. Rad al-Qadri, Rad received his DPhil from the University of Oxford, which you might have heard of. They call it the Texas A&M of England. In international affairs and Middle East politics. He has since gone on to a very successful career in the consulting business. He works for Boston Consulting Group, formerly worked for Petroleum Finance Company. He's one of the leading, I would say he's one of the leading experts on Iraqi politics and the energy scene in Iraq in the world. 2003, 2004, he served as a special assistant to what was in effect the British ambassador in Baghdad, although he didn't have an ambassadorial title because there wasn't a government stood up to send an ambassador to. He was the special assistant to the UK's special representative to Iraq. He's a frequent visitor back to Iraq. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Rad, who has visited Houston before, because he's an energy consultant, so they do come to Texas. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So we're at a turning point, it seems to me, in the fight against ISIS, right? The thing that has absorbed Iraqi politics and the American approach to Iraq and Syria for the last 2.5 years, right? The fight against the territorial state that ISIS was trying to establish seems to be coming toward an end, right? Mosul has been liberated. Tel Afar has been liberated. There are very few substantial territorial areas in Iraq that ISIS now controls. But it seems to me that for the past 2.5 years, Iraqi politics in many ways has been on hold because everybody has been able to focus on ISIS. Nobody likes them. And I just wonder, Ambassador Faley, I'll start with you. What has been put on hold in Iraq, and what are we going to see? What are the issues that are going to come up once the ISIS question, at least in terms of ISIS as a territorial entity within Iraq, is over? What's going to be on the agenda?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for having me and my colleague here. I think the key question has been to the Iraqis is what format do they want the state to be in once they resolve the internal politics issues? So what's issues of citizenships, wealth, decentralization, and so on. So there has been on hold quite a few issues. In fact, we have not been very good at closure in a lot of the issues. And here, legacy has been an important factor of ours. So about 2 years ago, Iraqis mentally was able to say, we will defeat ISIS. It's defeatable. So mentally, they switched on that aspect of it. However, to prepare for the day after ISIS, you require a lot of new legislations, focus of reconstructions, areas which have been destroyed, displaced people need to go back. So these type of things are urgent issues, which is stopping you from having a long-term planning. So at this moment, the challenges we have are preventing us from, the width of the challenges we have is somewhat preventing us from having any long-term planning because we have expectations of international countries, including USA, to help us in the redevelopment, not to pay for it, but to help us with the better environment, better management of it as well. I would say that the scale of the challenges Iraqi face has been itself mentally destabilizing or enables you to think about long-term planning because you need teamwork. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the key challenges we have.
But the teamwork issue is interesting because there seems to have been some amount of teamwork against ISIS. Will that teamwork, say between the Kurdish regional government and the central government in Baghdad, between Sunni Arab forces that rallied against ISIS and cooperated with the central government, whereas before they had serious problems with the government in Baghdad, will the defeat of ISIS kind of make that teamwork less likely to occur?
No, it gave us a good example, an acid test of where we can work together and focus on the challenges of the threat of ISIS. Because ISIS was an existential threat to the country.
Right.
But when you get around that issue, politics comes into it. When you remove the issues of immediate threat to your existence, politics comes into it. And that's the key challenge we have. We have not had what you might call enough founding fathers of the state. And here the US...
Or maybe too many.
No, we don't have them.
Okay.
Not too many. We don't have that caliber of the founding fathers of state whom we can go back to in reference and say, okay, you guys need to sit down together and say, we will resolve these constitutional challenges. These are issues regarding to the decentralization and other issues of that aspect. Here, the U.S. role has been questionable in how much did they implant founding fathers, or did the society was able to develop it. Democracy is in question as a result of that as well.
Right. Trudy, when the United States faces the end of the campaign against ISIS as a territorial state, it has some questions to answer too, right? Because in many ways, our re-engagement with Iraq under the Obama administration was very much directed at an anti-ISIS campaign. After some amount of years where I'm sure that people in the Obama administration might disagree, but I think Iraq was not a top priority for the administration. So now that we have a new administration, which also came into office saying that the primary American goal in the Middle East is counterterrorism and the fight against ISIS, when the territorial fight against ISIS ends, what are the choices America is going to face vis-a-vis Iraq, vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis the region?
Well, I think the basic choice is, do we or do we not want to make the same mistake that I believe we made back in 2011 when we pulled out entirely, which facilitated the rise of ISIS. And I think the reason that I say that is because in pulling out entirely, it meant that the United States stopped watching the domestic politics of Iraq, failed to be there or to have the intelligence assets to see that ISIS was penetrating the city of Mosul long before their fighters came in and the foreign fighters came in across the border from Syria. So we were unaware of what was going on, and there was a vacuum of power there, and sectarian strife was increasing, and we just had no eyes and ears. So the question now, I believe, is, are we going to revert to that kind of thinking, pull out again? One of the things that happened that was so critical to the fall of Mosul and the rise of ISIS as a territorial state was that the Iraqi army, which we had spent so much resources in training, had been hollowed out in a way, at least its officer corps, during the government of Prime Minister Maliki, where political officers replaced professional officers, and where there was not a clear chain of command, and therefore when ISIS came in, the army collapsed. The US successfully trained counterterrorism forces who have borne the brunt of the fighting to retake Mosul. But the question is now whether we will continue to train to try to put back together a professional army, because ISIS will reemerge as a terrorist group. And so, first of all, if there is not a professional army with the logistics to do a better job than the pre-fall of Mosul army, we could see a reversion. Secondly, you have a question of militias that sprang up during the fight against ISIS. There is a risk that some of these hardline militias will take over the army from within, sort of like the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and many of them have strong relations with Iran. General Qasem Soleimani, often in Baghdad. So if the US is not present and playing a role in military training, that is more likely to happen. And I think third, it will be important whether the United States, not in a nation-building way, but in a mediation way, can perhaps be active in trying to encourage both Sunni-Shia dialogue, which will be essential if one is going to prevent a return to bitter Sunni communities, many of whom are very frightened that now that ISIS is gone, there will be revenge taking and Shia militias will come after them. And then also a US presence will be critical in trying to mediate the tensions between the Kurds and Baghdad. And as you all may or may not know, there is a referendum on Kurdish independence coming up on September 25th. This is not to declare independence, but it is to express the will of the Kurds. And this is causing a lot of tension with Baghdad. In the past, the U.S. has played a mediating role, especially in areas of disputed territories. The Kurds have taken over areas which they pushed ISIS out of that are disputed with Baghdad. And so I think that is also an important role the U.S. will play. And basically, Washington has to decide, do they want a stable Iraq after we have invested so much in this country, or are we willing to pull another 2011 and let the country fall back into chaos, in which case I think we'll be looking at another problem that will affect our security, where we'll have to come in and do the same all over again.
So is your read of this administration that they're up to this task? Because this, I mean, it seems to me that the president, much like President Obama, campaigned on the idea that getting out of the Middle East is what we should do. That the Middle East is this swamp that has kind of dragged America in, and what we have to do is kind of remove ourselves. Now, we saw him reverse himself on Afghanistan, presumably on the advice, he says on the advice of his military commanders and his foreign policy advisors, most of whom are ex-generals. Do you have a sense of where the Trump administration is going on kind of phase 2 on Iraq? Yeah. That's why we brought you down, Trudy.
Right. No, I didn't know if we had moved on to Rod.
No, I've got other things for him.
Frankly, what President Trump's concern is, he can't take the oil. So therefore, that eliminates.
We will not give it up.
Yeah, right. So that, when the Coalition Provisional Authority was in place, when we first came in 2003, there was a gentleman who was a very senior oil executive from Houston who was brought in. I've forgotten his name. And he told me then that he was trying to explain to some of the officials from Bush 43 administration who were there, no, you can't take the oil. It's against international law. This is a sovereign country.
So it's also in the ground. I don't know if we have enough buckets to take
right,
it, right?
Exactly. So since the oil cannot be taken, that removes one primary interest of President Trump. I imagine that in his gut, he would just as soon bring the troops home. However, there are at least two mitigating factors. One is that his generals, and now we are in a position where the generals are the sane people and the civilian is the questionable. There is certainly an awareness at the Defense Department, General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, General Kelly, this is not his area, but I'm sure he is aware of this. The U.S. military put a lot of blood and treasure into training the Iraqi military. It went awry because of politics. That led to a huge terrorist threat. It would be foolish to make that mistake again, and I think U.S. military commanders and civilians in this administration recognize it. The mitigating factor with Trump may be the selling point that Iran is involved in this equation. If Trump, the dots are connected for him, the case can be made that simply to pull out is to hand Iran a lot more influence than it already has, and to have no mitigating push against Iranian influence, and also to permit the rise of terrorism. This may be a case that President Trump can understand. So my betting is that if the Iraqis are willing, and it seems that they will be, we would keep a troop presence there.
Rod, Iran. Trudy mentioned Iranian influence in
said
Iraq.
nothing about Iran.
You weren't listening when she said that?
No, yes, I was.
So the United States is not the only outside power that has a say in what's going on in Iraq. How do you read the role of Iran in Iraq these days? And then I want to ask you following on Luqman, do you think that the experience of fighting against ISIS, which brought together a lot of the elements of the Iraqi body politic, can carry over to the post campaign against ISIS?
First, thanks for having me, Greg. I really
a pleasure
appreciate it.
to- it's a
And
pleasure to
thanks to
have you.
Shira Helms for organizing my life. I owe her big time. Can I start with a second question first, because I think it links?
Okay.
I have a slightly different take to my good friend Luqman in terms of Iraqi politics. Not so much because it hasn't shown, as he said so rightly, it hasn't shown the areas where Iraqis can work together. But primarily because I think since 2014, different Iraqi factions have had their eye on post-ISIS. I don't think politics stopped for a moment. In fact, I think it was accelerated. And for all of the reasons that he mentioned in terms of the issues that have not been addressed since 2003. I mean, when I worked in Iraq, I had a line that I would give people in private that, fundamentally the issues that really had never been worked out were what the future of the state was going to look like and what the shape of national reconciliation was going to be. Critically, what was your entry card into politics and what role did you have? And was there an equal playing field? In 2003, there wasn't, and the issue of the future of the state and what the state would look like was never really resolved. We kicked that can down the road through discussions for the transitional administrative law, through those discussions in the Constitution. And the hope always was that the Iraqis would pick it up and that fundamentally the Iraqis would take responsibility for this. And they never did. The factions didn't, because in part we protected them in the green zone. And that was, we created a political system where you almost didn't have to answer to your population. So I think what the Iraqis have, what Iraqi political factions did in 2014, and I'm reminded of the Kurds' first statement, Erbil's first statement when ISIS invaded Mosul was, this is an issue between the Sunni and the Shia. This is not an issue for us. And you saw that very rapid move by the Peshmerga to expand territory to borders that they wanted to claim in the long term. I think the Kurds have had, or certainly the KDP has had, a very clear agenda that has gradually become more public, which will reach its conclusion, or at least its first conclusion with the referendum, which is to say we are planning for an independent state after this, or for a very different state. I think Shia and Sunni politics has gone through similar evolutions. And there's a lot to be said about domestic politics in Baghdad that has changed. And indeed, some of the reaction to the existing status quo that's taken place. And Iran's going to be a factor in that. Taking it sort of through to Iran. This notion that Iran runs Iraq, or Iran runs the Shia parties, or Iran sort of, that there is somehow some mastermind sitting in Tehran who's moving around the pieces a la sort of, the gods of Olympus. It just has never been the case. The reality is that Iran has a very, very long border with Iraq. It has a long history of antipathy. It moved very, very quickly post the invasion in 2003. And we helped by putting some of its key assets in positions of power and supported them there. So Iran has arguably always been one step ahead of everyone in the game, including the Americans, including the Brits, including the coalition at large in terms of, and it's been extremely ruthless in terms of pursuing its policies. Iran's going to continue to do that as long as there is a regional power play going on. And that's what you have in the Middle East. Seeing Iraq in isolation ignores a wider regional power play that's been going on between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey primarily, which has been a battle over spheres of influence and in many ways has been considered a battle over hegemony. And Iraq is a factor in that. Iraq is one of those areas where the Iranians, because it's on their borders, have acted more ruthlessly than others. But I think you have to see Iranian moves at a regional level in terms of that. At a domestic level, you also have independent agents. Each of these players that sort of bows to Iran at one point or another does it for their own interests. Nouri al-Maliki, who is now synonymous with Iranian interests, ran his campaign in 2009 and 2010 by defying Iran publicly, by saying there would be no Shia alliance. He was running on his own.
But he had to go to Tehran because
But he had to go to
he
Tehran
had to go to
afterwards.
Tehran to stay as prime minister.
Absolutely, and the Iranians will have a say in that. But I think what you're seeing is, and interesting, I think the moves by Saudi Arabia, which have happened of late, what you're seeing is the rest of the region catching up with the game, that isolating Iraq in this kind of area doesn't help.
Right.
And so you start to compete for influence. The Iranians are going to be paramount.
So what's happened to the Iranian relationship with its allies and clients in Iraq?
I think it's evolved. And, those allies and clients have differed over time.
Right.
When I served in Iraq, we had some decent information that went round, that we were privy to, that suggested that the Iranian influence went well beyond just some Shia groups. The Iranians have had tremendous influence in Kurdistan, the area that often presents itself as our closest ally. Has been as responsive to Iranian influence as any other through Iraq. So I think what you've had is an evolution of Iranian influence. It's moved from client to client, but an issue, and I know it's one you wanted to ask Luqman about, but this issue of how Iraqi domestic politics is evolving, and how Iran is now being used by some nominal former clients to actually stand out from the pack. Muqtada Sadr's Iraqi Arab nationalism suggests that Iran doesn't get it all its own way.
But Muqtada had always been on that line, right, of Iraqi Arab nationalism.
Yes, but Muqtada was also deemed to be an Iranian agent for a long time.
I view it
Lived
slightly
in Iran.
differently. I view it as if a vacancy is there, whatever the vacancy is, whether it's a position or a concept or a discourse or whatever, that would be filled. And the Iranians are the sharpest to fill that by, for example, when ISIS comes in, they are the sharpest to respond back.
Right.
The American came in 2 months or 3 months afterward. That type of fast response is where the Iraqi politics need to be mature enough not to allow an external party. Now, for example, the Saudis are fast, fill that gap faster enough. But you have to bear in mind with all the legacy we've had with the Saudis for the last 10 years, where the majority of the jihadist suicide bombers are from Saudi Arabia, for example. So we have those issues. Here, I think the Iranians are the sharpest by hedging their bets more. And the other question I have, talking about the U.S. role, which is primarily what does U.S. wants from Iraq? And that's the question everybody's asking me now.
Trudy, what do we want from Iraq?
From Iran.
No, from Iraq.
From Iraq.
From Iraq. I'm not sure we know what we want from Iraq. I think it's in a way, it's negatives. We don't want a return of ISIS. We don't want Iranian control, whatever that means.
Right.
And there is also this narrative, which I was just earlier discussing this with Rod, which some people think is this narrative, which some people think is vastly exaggerated and others swear by, but it's this idea that Iran wants to establish a land corridor running through Iraq, Sinjar, northern Syria, and into Lebanon, where it can supply Hezbollah. And there has been a lot of debate in the White House about what kind of resources to put into preventing this land corridor. And in fact, a key Middle East expert on the National Security Council, Derek Harvey, was eased out, aka fired. Fired, yes, by H.R. McMaster, because there was a little group in the National Security Council which were advocating and hoping that President Trump would buy it because it was anti-Iranian, to put a lot of U.S. forces on the Iraqi border to try to prevent this land corridor. So negatives, prevent. In terms of positive, I think people who are thinking more long range, this is the thrust of the report that Ambassador Crocker chaired from the Atlantic Council, is a stable Iraq, because obviously a stable Iraq is critical for the region. Those people who are thinking in these terms, and unfortunately the State Department is sort of absent in this whole game, because Secretary Tillerson doesn't seem to be able to get a handle on it, or is incapable of. Those people who are thinking long range, there's encouragement of Saudi Arabia, which has borne some fruit to try to reopen the border, which is doing, have closer relations, to try to balance Iranian influence, and also as a stabilizing factor to help the economic development of Iraq, and which would be good for the whole region. And also Iraqi oil. I mean, it's up to
4.5 million. a day.
million. And so, I mean, this is an important element, but we can't take it.
Right.
So I don't know that there's clear thinking at the top, but I think there's issues that different people in the administration are focused on.
I want to follow up with one thing, but I'm going to ask the ambassadors to start collecting the questions. So if you have questions, please pass them to the center. Here, pass there, and over here, pass to the center. So one thing that happened during this campaign against ISIS, it seems to me, is that a more direct military relationship was established between Washington and the Kurdish regional government. Against the objections of the government in Baghdad, but because of the overriding desire in Washington, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, to confront ISIS, we engaged in a much more direct military relationship with the KRG. I think that there are all sorts of people in the KRG, the Kurdish regional government, who would be extremely happy for the United States to adopt them as a new ally. What do you think the thinking in Washington is on the Kurds? There's enormous sympathy for the Kurds in Iraq across the partisan lines, right, in the Congress. But there had always been kind of a State Department executive branch sense that we're not going to encourage Kurdish independence. We want a unified Iraq. That's always been the stated American policy. Where are we now on the whole issue with the referendum coming up of American position toward the Kurds and desires for independence?
The U.S. position is on the referendum, not now. It's U.S. officials, and this is both State Department and executive, they're not saying never, but U.S. officials are extremely worried that having the referendum in September is somehow going to boomerang against the prospects of Iraqi elections, which will take place in 2018. Right. Perhaps the Kurds won't participate in the elections. If the Kurds are not a bloc in the Iraqi parliament, this will affect who's going to be prime minister. U.S. officials want to see Abadi retain the prime ministership. So there's a lot of nervousness. There has been a parade of senior officials going to talk to the Kurds to ask them, please not now, wait. And the Kurdish response has been, the only daylight on this, the Kurds are saying, no, we're going to hold this referendum, and the only daylight has been, but maybe we would postpone it if you, the Americans, can guarantee us and get Baghdad to guarantee us that the referendum will be accepted a year from now, after the elections, that there will be no obstacle to holding it, and that the results will be accepted. So the U.S. is struggling with this. So far, they have not been able to convince the Kurds. And the Kurds are also making the case, arguing to the Americans that Iraq is now in the hands of Iran. The Iranians are going to push your troops, the U.S. troops, out after ISIS is gone, and you need Kurdistan as the only place where you can have a secure base. There are no doubt some people, especially in Congress, who are open to this argument, but this argument is not popular at the State Department.
Right. Rod, Iraq needs money to reconstruct itself. Oil prices over the last 2.5 years have, as we know here in Texas, gone down by 50%. Could you talk a little bit about where you see the Iraqi oil industry these days and the fiscal situation in Iraq? I mean, it's a lot easier to bring factions together if you've got more money to spread around. And there's just not as much money to spread around as there was 2.5 years ago.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that fiscal question goes to the heart of how Iraqi politics is going to develop over the next 5 to 10 years. And the reality is that there isn't the money in the budget to keep the state in the current shape that it is. Particularly given the high level of public spending that's built into the budget.
Right, and oil accounts for 90%.
And oil accounts for 90%, but it is, the oil revenue could conceivably be enough if your non-discretionary public spending, and by that I mean the current spending on wages, on salaries, on pensions, etc., can be removed. So the Iraqis face, I think any Iraqi government faces a very, very difficult issue. And that is that it can't really cut those subsidies. Right. The efforts at reform have been pushed back. Its efforts to rationalize the system, and particularly to sort of approach, to try and take on corruption, etc., have failed. Its institutional reform efforts that would potentially deliver more effective government have failed, and the prospects of oil prices rising significantly are lower.
That's because of us.
Well, that is, but
that's because we're fracking, and we,
You are fracking cool. What can I tell you? But there's another issue as well. I mean, I think just as a quick aside on the Iraqi oil industry, Trudy mentioned the numbers. One of the things that Baghdad may find is somewhat exposed. If there is a move towards Kurdish independence, is actually in terms of the budget, it will be net neutral to Baghdad. Because relatively speaking, what the Kurds export now in terms of volumes and what they're owed from the Iraqi government in terms of budget revenue works out to be about 17% of both. It's 17% of exports. It may be a little lower in terms of exports, and it's 17% of the budget. So that is net neutral. Where the Iraqis are going to be exposed a little more is that I think they're making up their export numbers, and I think they're making up their production numbers. And there is a remarkable.
They're saying they're underestimating or overestimating.
They're overestimating, and potentially, they appear to be double counting Kurdish exports and Kurdish production to the tune of about 300,000 barrels a day. So when Baghdad certainly inflated its numbers prior to the OPEC meeting last November when quotas were about to be reestablished. Right. So the Iraqis are talking about a capacity of 4.7 million barrels a day that they've reduced it to 4.5. Arguably Baghdad would struggle to meet 4.2 production at maximum output at this moment in time. But that oil industry issue, I think there's going to be a challenge with that oil industry issue as well, which is that, one of the problems that Iraq has had to tackle is, for all of the talk of, foreigners taking their oil, the reality is that the Iraqis have got a pretty good deal out of foreign companies in terms of the contracts that they've signed. I mean, with a heavy government take for Iraq. But more importantly, the Iraqis have played fast and loose in terms of payments at times. Now, over the last 12 months, the IMF has done a really good job of keeping their feet to the fire. The challenge, goes back to the bigger fiscal question. The challenge that investors are going to face, the challenge the Iraqis are going to face over the next 12 to 24 months is the war with ISIS is over or is coming to an end. And there is a massive reconstruction task. And it's a reconstruction task that the rest of the world doesn't have the financial appetite to fund. We're not back in CPA days. We're not back at sort of $18 billion being given in aid and more being increased. And I think, one of the sort of the bits to add to Trudy's comments on the US administration is it's not clear that this administration has any appetite to start funding that kind of reconstruction in the way that, that the George W. Bush administration had. So I think Iraq is going to find itself in dire financial straits, and that is going to come at a time when, as Luqman mentioned, there are some really tough political issues that are going to have to be addressed, and some issues of how you restructure the state going to be addressed.
I think talking about talked about the zero sum, and Rad talked about the hard questions. Here, if you have a a harmonious political system, the tough questions will be able to answer, or the people will, okay, the politicians whom we have elected have come up with those issues. But if the politicians are sniping at each other and a zero-sum game comes in, any hard decisions need to be made in relation to reform or corruption and others, where the Prime Minister will feel vulnerable or others will feel vulnerable. And that's the key issues we have. So we need more harmonious politics to help us in resolving the issues. However, on a good side to talking about the oil, it has been one of the success factors over the last 10 years. The increase in oil production, the consistency of it, the stability of that. However, I mean, to be honest, even on the transparency of the oil issues, I mean, it's one of the most transparent. Who do you sell and everything else? How do you spend it? That's a different issue.
Right.
So to that effect, I think we have a good story to base it in, but the clock is ticking globally in relation to this commodity.
Prices, yeah.
Just to add to that, I mean, you're absolutely right. The notion of 12.5 million barrels a day, which was thrown out in 2009, 2010, was always a fallacy.
Right.
6.5 million barrels a day for 30 years was Iraq's, or 6 million barrels a day was Iraq's target. They're getting close to that, and that is. But Luqman's point is an absolutely central one. And I think it's not just the issue of harmonious politics. You are starting to see already, I mean, people look at Iraq as if somehow things come out of a vacuum. You are starting to see already the trends that are going to create the most problems. You have had a discussion that has gone on now for the last 3 years, in terms, certainly post-ISIS, which has been about decentralization of power, with no preparation for it,
Right.
and no capacity building at a local level for
And
it.
nobody mentoring it.
But a demand from the region, or demand from the provinces to say, you have messed up as the central government, so it's our time. The second thing you're seeing is...
But there's no fiscal basis for provincial autonomy.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The second thing that you're seeing is this thing that I mentioned, against a battle against the status quo. And Luqman is far more familiar with this than I am. But a younger generation of politicians who see nothing but corruption and mismanagement and are beginning to blame the senior echelons. So at a time when a state faced with the kind of reconstruction effort that the Iraqi state would need to be faced with would be in trouble anyway, particularly given the lack of funds. But you will have, at the same time, the Kurdish independence struggle going on and hitting its peak. Again, the question of how the state should manage itself hitting its peak, and potentially an effort to change the political foundations and the political generations in Iraq hitting its peak.
And the dependency on the regional powers. Because now Iraqis are saying, the young generation, and you talked about Muqtada Said, Muqtada Sadr being more Iraqis in that sense, are saying that the current dependency on the Turkey or Iran or others is not working for us.
Right.
The threat here is democracy will be in question, because we're saying if these are candidates whom we are representative, whom we are electing, are creating that, then therefore, I would say we are at a transition. Do we go more central, better decision making, go back to the days of a sort of Saddam type of system, right. Or do we decentralize, and here the Kurdish issue comes in and others, and therefore the country may be split. So the politicians have a major moral responsibility, historical responsibility, in saying, okay, would it be in my time the country is split? And that's where it's fearful, and that's where it prevents them from having hard questions being answered.
And you're not getting any sort of focus from Washington.
Oh.
And if you had someone like Ryan sitting there in Washington actually managing this, you'd have faith that these various swirls were being absorbed. I think Washington's focus is overwhelmingly on the security and military side of this. So all of this, the politics is being left aside. And that's why the surge failed, because you didn't focus on the politics.
Ryan might disagree on the surge failing, but thank you very much for your questions. There were a couple of themes that I've been able to glean out of them that I'm going to propose to the panelists. Trudy, I'd like to start with you. There were a number of questions about Turkey. We're talking a lot about Kurds. We're talking about regional powers. We spoke about Saudi Arabia trying to get back in the game. We spoke a lot about Iran. The Turks obviously have a lot to say about this. What's your sense of where things are with Turkey and Iraq, and also maybe Turkey and the United States? Because there's, I think, some more serious tensions between Ankara and Washington than there have been in a number of years.
I think that right now, when you look at Turkey and the Iraqi Kurdish issue, it's symptomatic of how confused and incoherent Turkey's policy has become in the region. Turkey failed dismally so far in its efforts in Syria.
Yeah.
And Turkey cannot seem to concoct a coherent policy towards the Kurdish referendum, which seems odd since, if you don't know the situation, since you know that the Turks are in the middle of a very tough repression of their own Kurds in the southeast, anyone suspected of anything to do with the PKK, the Turkish rebel group. The Turks historically, in the last several years, have developed a very close relationship with the Iraqi Kurdish leadership, especially Masoud Barzani and the KDP, and they have not come out in any draconian fashion against the Kurdish referendum. They've said they don't want it. They've actually had meetings with the Iranians on this, but they have not threatened it. In fact, their foreign minister has said that their opposition to the referendum will not affect exports of oil and trade with Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, this is the key issue for the Iraqi Kurds. They need to export their oil through Turkey. So there is a confusion here because Turkey needs the Iraqi Kurds. They do enormous amount of business. They benefit from having the oil transited. And so they're in a Goldilocks mode, you know, not too hot, not too cold. And I think that confusion also affects the rest of their policy towards Iraq. I mean, there was a point when it seemed as if Turkey thought it could play a major role in the north of Iraq. It used the Turkmen card, Iraqi Turkmen who are of Turkic ancestry. And yet, one of the key questions in the referendum is Kirkuk, disputed territories where there's a large Turkmen population, not as large as the Turkmen or the Turks say it is, but still. And yet, Turkey has not come out clearly against the referendum. I think there is confusion in Ankara about what to do because everything that the Turks have tried, both in Syria and in Iraq so far, has failed. And so Turkey's influence is less than has been expected. And it seems that if the referendum goes forward, the Turks will still have a close relationship with the Iraqi Kurds.
There's a persistent theme in the questions about stability and unity in Iraq. Some of the themes were, well, when was Iraq ever stable? And if Iraq gets past the ISIS, the fight against ISIS, what remains to keep Iraq together? I mean, most obviously on the Kurdish Arab side, but also, you know, in terms of regional autonomy, in terms of sectarian tensions among the Arab population. I wonder if our two Iraqi guests could talk a little bit about the idea of Iraq and what is still there that helps keep Iraq together, that helps keep Iraqis sensing that they would prefer to have an Iraqi state rather than, you know, a bunch of mini-states emerging out of the territory that's now Iraq.
I think the questions are, with ISIS, it sharpened our mind as to the commonalities of the threat if we don't get our act together. That was a good example, and people are reminded of that. In a very harsh lesson, by the way. I mean, ISIS tried to more or less threat the country division. Also certainly talked about the minorities and tried to, you know, the Yazidis and the others as well, right. The Shias and so on. So to that effect,
minorities.
It's one of the most tragic stories in 21st century, having that sort of enslaving of the people and so on. So we have a good example of when we don't get our act together. On the other side, people are saying democracy is an important foundation. The Americans have introduced a system for us. We need to embrace it. We don't want to go back to the dictatorship system of Saddam Hussein. Centralization is not working for us. But so they have a vision of that, how to get there. You need the tools, the leadership, the capabilities. an environment which allows the politics to flourish. These are the key questions here we have. The region itself is not democratic. The region itself is destabilizing, Arab Springs and so on. So these are bad examples for us to follow. We're not in the East Europe versus West Europe sort of situation. So that's what, or Germany, East Germany versus sort of emergence of Germany. So to those expecting, the question is, the visions of the people is right. And these are the key issues why it has kept the state as is. Any other country with such a tremendous challenge we have, where we have at the peak of it, minimum of 100 car bombs sort of within a month, 4,000 people casualties a month just from terrorism aspect of it, at the peak of it. So these type of examples are usually put states, destroy states. We have not. Against all the odds, because regardless of the background of the people, they want democracy, they want a harmonious system, but they want their electricity to work. They want basic services to be provided. And that's the key issue we've had the challenge of it. These dreams are still there. I would doubt any time people talk about the division, in the sense of division. However, we need more than a vision for us to materialize it.
Even in the Kurdish regions.
Well, the Kurdish region have different challenges, by the way. They have, in one way, they are far ahead in relation to the decision making, but in relation to the geopolitics, it's much harder. Because you have the Turkey, you have the Iranian. Yeah. People always underestimate the Iranian influence of the Turkish issue. It is huge.
Right.
People always, for example, the Arab countries won't talk about the Sunni Shia aspect of it. The Arab countries want Kurds to stay part of Iraq to be a counterbalance to the Shia majority. Yeah. Just right. as a simple example. And that's where I think we still have key component missing for us to get a good formula together. Mm-hmm. However, whatever we have may be able to keep us together. Doesn't mean in a healthy position, but still gel together.
Rod?
Just a small go ahead. To gel it immediately, there are two issues. We need to get our judiciary and we need to get our military. I'm talking about here the army, not any kind of factions or anything.
Right.
The army has to gel the state together and judiciary has to. These are the two urgent issues we need to fix now. Sorry,
Rod?
Yeah, when's Iraq? I've actually spent my time trying to think, when has Iraq ever been stable? And I always
the halcyon days of King Faisal I.
Even that wasn't hugely stable.
Yeah.
But I think there's a danger in running from that and sort of to the should Iraq ever been created, etc. And forgetting that if you took a map of the end of this First World War and looked around and saw what countries existed and what countries didn't exist, or sort of certainly if you went back 50 years before that, you'd be surprised what countries that are taken for granted were actually sort of a set of stateless. So I don't think that in and of itself, the geography in and of itself necessarily is the issue. It goes back to two things. We from my personal opinion, and some of you have heard me say this before, we made a number of key mistakes when we went into Iraq in 2003 and had the opportunity to lay the foundations for stability. One was we introduced a system that was by its very nature divisive. This was the sort of, and by its very nature acted against effective national reconciliation. By dividing things along ethno-sectarian lines, by putting in quotas. Now, part of that was pressure on us from our Iraqi interlocutors at the time. Part of it was an unwillingness to upset those interlocutors in a way that would serve our long-term national interests. So that's a whole different debate. But the other thing is you took away what was left of the remnants of institutions in the country and never rebuilt them. I go back to this point about the Iraqi political system or Iraqi government actually being protected within the walls of the Green Zone to a large extent, and really the Iraqis never having to be accountable, Iraqi leaders never having to be accountable for their mistakes. So if you look at institution building, and I remember being in a meeting in the CPA in 2003 and being told very, very clearly that institution building was a 1980s and 1990s way of thinking. Yeah. We were now in the era of democracy, and I kind of threw up my hands and went, okay, that's good to know. Have you been outside recently? Yeah. But there is that issue of you have to build up effective, independent institutions that are going to mean that the state and government operates for its people.
But Luqman says the army has to be one of those institutions.
And the army may well have to be one, but I would
But
argue
isn't that that's a double-edged sword?
it is a double-edged sword. I would
Given
argue
the
that
history of military intervention in Iraqi politics.
Absolutely, but I think where Luqman is going, and it is this issue of what are the mechanisms you can use to cement and solidify a sense of national
What gels a country together?
identity.
Immediately.
But it's part of what gels it, and then part of it what makes it operate. One way of looking at where the Iraqis are and the reasons that you have, both the sort of fragmentation that's taking place, the retreat of the state, and the opportunities, quite frankly, for a bunch of warlords to take over, and the Kurds are only just one step beyond that, is the fact that you have communities that feel no sense of protection and had no sense of welfare from the state, and no institutional administrative capability to deliver that. So what do you fall back on?
Right.
I mean, what is it that's going to define your security under those circumstances? If you can't be guaranteed that the state is going to protect you, that the judiciary is independent, that rule of law operates, then yes, you know what? If your area happens to be dominated by Shia soldiers, you're going to
Right.
take on your Shia identity
Right.
because they will protect you.
Can I add a point?
Yeah.
And for the audience perspective, so that we put the full picture together. 2003, the state collapsed.
Right.
Not just the government.
Well, the state didn't collapse. The United States and the coalition destroyed the state.
It doesn't. Okay. Well,
Right.
who
We
pushed
like
the-
to-
We
the
like to
state-
say dismantle.
Right. The state was being chopped away by
Doesn't matter.
misgovernance.
I'm talking about the
sanctions.
result.
Right. Right.
Not who
right.
did it, but
Right.
the point is, thereafter, day after scenario, people said, okay, where is my social contract with the state?
Right.
Whatever the new state is, that's what we're trying to define. So this challenge we're after are tremendous because of the dictatorship, because of the mismanagement and other aspect of it as well. Maybe because of the grand vision we have. Maybe because of that. Maybe we're not content with our politics.
Let's conclude this round with another theme that came through in so many of the questions, which is, okay, the campaign against ISIS seems to be going well, but what's to prevent when that ends and Iraqi politics goes back to what it was before, new groups arising, or Al-Qaeda reestablishing itself in Iraq, or some new terrorist organization that could be a threat not only to Iraqis, but regionally and even to the United States emerging. This, I think, is very much reflective of kind of the central theme of both the Obama and the Trump administrations toward Iraq, which is the counterterrorism element. So I'll just ask each one of you to talk a little bit about that. Trudy, if you'd begin, and then we'll thank the panel and bring Ambassador Crocker up.
I was in East Mosul in March. And when you drive from Erbil along the road to East Mosul, you go by all these destroyed Christian towns. But when you're getting close to East Mosul, which is Sunni, which was controlled by ISIS, I was there just after it was liberated, the militias that were on the road, guarding the road, were Shiite Turkmen waving the banner of Imam Hussein. For the Sunnis living in the residential districts adjacent to the main road, every family I spoke to wanted to leave. They were afraid that Shiite militias were going to control the city, that there was going to be revenge taking against people who they claimed had no choice, and so forth. So I think, the question of whether terrorism will arise again comes right back to the issue that we were just discussing, which is there any way to keep the Iraqi state together in a way that gives benefit to everyone who is a part of that state? Under Saddam Hussein, you had fear, you had the Ba'ath ideology, you had a security state. It was kept
And a lot of oil money.
and a lot of
A lot of oil money, right?
and a lot
which
of oil
which
money.
Saddam
Right.
used
So
strategically.
you had stability. if it was like in communism, if you didn't pick your head up and say anything political, and you didn't happen to be a Shiite in the wrong place in the wrong time or a Kurd, you could go to university. I was there in 1990, and the girls had skirts up to here, and nobody wore a headscarf, and nobody asked if you were Shiite or Sunni if you were at Baghdad University. I don't know what the glue is going to be, whether there is a loyalty to Iraq, whether you can find some way of crossing the boundaries between Shia and Sunni. There are some efforts being made. Of all people, Muqtada al-Sadr is now talking with the secularist Yad Alawi, is going to Saudi Arabia. Ammar Hakim, a Shiite cleric who was part of a Shiite cleric movement, has now left that movement, saying he wants to bridge the gap between Sunni and Shia. I do not know whether you could have a new generation that believed in something called a new Iraq and could challenge the sectarian politics. There are huge vested interests in keeping those sectarian politics because money, patronage, oil money are funneled through sectarian parties. So to me, that's the challenge. I don't think we know if terrorism can be prevented from reemerging because it depends so tremendously on whether Sunnis can be fitted back into society, whether minorities will have a place there, whether within the Shiite camp there'll be a civil war, whether Shiite militias will persecute Sunnis, even those who weren't with ISIS. These are all the big question marks. And the US presence, I think, is a gamble. But I think what you can say is at least there's some potential for mediating in some of these conflicts because there will be a desire from many Iraqi forces to have that presence there, but it's certainly no guarantee.
Right. Luqman?
Well, I think moving forward, we talked about the hard questions that need to be raised. There is a sense of nationalism being increased. The Prime Minister is promoting more of the challenges, addressing some of the key challenges there. He's providing a good role model or example in relation to being an Iraqi first aspect of it. The military campaigns are going well with the collaboration of all the various factions from the various ethnicities, localities, and so on. So here we have a good example. We still have not been able to understand what the US, for example, or other countries are seeking from Iraq perspective. What are they willing to contribute in relation to stability? Gulf countries have talked always about putting some money into reconstruction, stabilization. Nothing has really materialized to that aspect of it. There has to be a clear contract by the regional powers, US, Iran, in understanding how could they work together in stabilizing Iraq. If it's viewed from Iraq perspective, it's easier. If you bring in the Syrian dimension, if you bring in the Saudi-Iranian dimension, Turkish vision or whatever that is now, so I think it becomes a bit more complicated. At this moment, the US has noticed that when they are vacant from the region, it doesn't, problems will come to it again. Its risk management has not worked. It needs to have a better mitigation plan put together. Until that's defined for us Iraqis, we will be playing our own politics in our own pace. And if it's a regional threat, unfortunately, that's something the region has to be wary about and worried about.
Rod, is it an outside-in game or an inside-out game?
I think it's both. And this gives me an opportunity not to be excoriated by Ryan when he gets up here, in the sense of, look, I think part of it goes back, you have a victory in much the same way as the military aspect of the surge was a victory. The question then becomes, what do you do on the political side? The surge was supposed to create the political space for Iraqis to come together to address their issues, to get rid of the security challenge. And the Iraqis singularly failed at doing that. In fact, every single faction sought to take advantage of the situation to push their own agenda. I think we're in that situation now, and that's what I meant about what we've seen since 2014, since June 2014, the various different factions positioning themselves. So it becomes both. On the one hand, there is loyalty to Iraq. I mean, you know, there is still day-to-day loyalty by a population to Iraq. You still have soldiers that are willing to die in the name of Iraq. I mean, outside of the Hashid, you have people willing to sacrifice. I think within the Kurds, that's obviously a different question,
Right.
but there are even some Kurds who will stand up and say, we are better as part of the Iraqi state than outside of it. I think what you have to have is, as I said, institutional reform to make the country work, to make the state work. And what you're going to have is the victory of a new generation of politicians in Iraq who are fighting the ancien regime. There are a set of politicians for whom the existing status quo benefits them personally and politically. They have a vested interest in protecting their prerogatives under the present system. Those guys are going to be eased out to allow what has emerged bottom up as a new style of Iraqi nationalist politics. Now, it may be that, you know, if the Kurds move fast with secession or towards secession, that provides a counterpoint that again that can become a rallying cry. It will be a dodgy one, but it will nonetheless potentially be there. But you've got to get at the same time, you have to stop Iraq and other places becoming a playground for regional powers. And the only way you achieve that is fundamentally, as the US, to acknowledge that you are going to have some kind of tacit security arrangement that includes everyone. Now, my read of the Obama...
that includes Iran.
Absolutely. Now,
Obviously.
my
Yeah,
read of the
course.
Obama administration and what it tried to do in terms of the JCPOA, and certainly the discussions I had with it, is that's what it had in mind. This was a way of bringing Iran back to the game.
Right.
And forcing the Saudis and the Israelis to deal with a new reality. You know, that didn't work, but you know, fundamentally one of the best things that the US could do is to start making regional politics not the zero-sum game, which means that, you know, fundamentally stability in any of these countries doesn't matter because you fear that stability might actually work against your own national security interests, to rather realizing that these issues have to be managed. And the thing that amazes me still, and I'll leave you with this thought, is, you know, these regional powers still seem to think there is virtue in chaos, that somehow there is an imaginary wall that stops this rolling over. If Iraq does go down a potential route, which is an unmanaged fragmentation, there is nothing in the sand to stop this going north, south, east, or west. And you know, as if I was in the position of being an American policymaker, that would be my starting point. How do I stop that outcome from happening, as opposed to some of the more tactical issues that matter to U.S. national security, but don't provide that long-term stability?
Just on a small point, isn't that what
We're
President...
cutting into Ambassador Crocker's
isn't
time.
that what President Obama concluded too in relation to
I'm
re-engagement
not
in
privy
Iraq?
to President Obama's mind.
Yeah,
so-
right. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Take your mics off, and we'll bring Ryan up. Thank you. The second act is about to begin. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who needs no introduction to a College Station audience, that's for sure. But I will just rehearse his ambassadorial positions, not chronologically, but geographically. From east to west, he was a U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, a U.S. ambassador to Iraq, a U.S. ambassador to Kuwait. He was the United States ambassador in Syria. He was the United States ambassador in Lebanon. I don't think I missed any, did I, Ryan?
Afghanistan.
Oh, I forgot Afghanistan. Of course.
People always do.
I should have gone Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. But Ryan has so many ambassadorial appointments that at least he can keep them straight, but I can't. So, Ryan, optimistic, pessimistic, what did you take from the discussion that we've had this last hour?
Well, surprisingly realistic. You don't often find that among academics.
Well, there were no academics in that group, I should say. So
That's my point.
yeah.
Again, these are three people I've known for some time in different capacities. Unlike so many of the talking heads you see on whatever your favorite TV flavor might be, they have been in this region. They have worked these issues. They know what it's like to be out there in the smoke and the dust trying to get something done. I do believe that we're at a different point right now with respect to Iraq than where we've been before. But we are seeing some pretty discouraging elements of continuity between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. I think the most obvious is one you've referred to, the determination to treat Islamic State as a purely military problem. That is what the Obama administration did, and by all accounts, that is what the Trump administration is now doing. It won't work. I was out there for the surge, and I will take violent exception to what Rod said about the surge, but I'm going to wait till everybody's gone. And,
Okay.
That's something else I learned in Iraq. So we could never, with 180,000 troops on the ground, we could not completely eliminate Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the predecessor of Islamic State. Little pockets in Mosul and up the Euphrates Valley, where they could find sanctuary because there were populations who did not see Al-Qaeda in Iraq as the worst thing in the world. They saw the Shia militias as the worst thing in the world, and very uncertain where the government of Iraq itself stood at that time. Well, now that has all been radicalized even further with the rise of the popular mobilization units, the Iranian-supported Shia militias. No funds, as we've heard pretty graphically, for major reconstruction. So, yes, Islamic State will eventually be pushed out of any territorial hold in Iraq. Then what? Well, there's going to be something coming down the line. I don't know what it is. Just as Islamic State became Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, there's a 3.0 out there somewhere waiting to be formed. All I can tell you is it will not be good, and it will not bring any kind of stability or security to the area. The only way forward I see, and I think my colleagues all referred to this in different ways, is a decision in Washington to play a long game in Iraq. To say that what happens in Iraq is fundamental to American national security, it is, and that we will treat it as the priority it deserves to be. That doesn't mean sending back the 101st Airborne, but it does mean serious political engagement. And here again, the Obama administration was absolutely allergic to Iraq. Secretary of State Clinton made exactly one visit in her 4 years. That wasn't by her choice. She got the importance of engagement there. She was told by the White House, don't go back. And in the Trump administration so far, we have seen precisely zero indication of even an understanding of the importance Iraq has for our security. So I would like to hope that the administration will move in a different direction. My expectations are under control, let's just say that.
Very good.
I'd say one thing, if I could, just about kind of the beginning of the end, if you will. So I was still ambassador when President Obama took office.
Right.
Under President Bush, just about every week, we would have a secure video National Security Council meeting, which he chaired as the president, normally on Wednesdays, almost every week. We had no idea what to expect from the Obama administration. We got the word, General Odierno was then the force commander, that President Obama wished to have an NSC the first full day he was in office. And he did. We didn't know what he wanted, so we decided we just would do what we did with the Bush NSC, which is I would start off with an overview of the political situation and the economic situation, Ray Odierno would then talk about the security situation. The President would then ask us if we had some decisions that needed to be made. And that's what we did almost every week. So in the absence of any further instruction, I cranked myself up, started the political brief. The President held up his hand and he said, "Gentlemen, before you get started, there's one thing I want to say to you. I don't want to screw this up." He screwed it up.
There was a question that came in from the audience that basically said, in essence, did Obama screw it up or did the Iraqis screw it up? Because the reference in the question was, in 2011, it didn't seem like the Iraqi political system was willing to give the status of forces agreement that would require certain immunities for American troops from prosecution in Iraq. They weren't willing to accept that. And so this question from the audience was more about history than looking forward, but could we have sustained troops there when you had an Iraqi government under Prime Minister Maliki who wasn't willing to give those guarantees to the United States, and who had returned to the prime ministership through the support of Iran, which wanted American troops out?
Well, this is going to be a little insider baseball-ish, I'm afraid, but it is important. So I was the lead negotiator in 2008 for both the political agreement, the Strategic Framework Agreement, and for the security agreement, not a SOFA.
Right.
A status of forces agreement takes years to negotiate, even with close allies. Well, we figured out how to do it then. In the security agreement of 2008, you'll not find a single reference to immunity. We did it through the use of the word jurisdiction, that the United States would have jurisdiction over its uniformed personnel when they were on base and when they were on duty. Iraq would have jurisdiction in any other situation. Now, it was very clear to all of us that any uniformed person in Iraq was, by definition, on duty all the time. And indeed, we never had a single case emerge in which the Iraqis challenged us on that. The other thing we did was we closed the agreement before it went to Parliament.
What do you mean you closed the agreement?
We signed it.
Signed it, okay.
Hushair Zabari, Iraq's foreign minister, and I, as American ambassadors, signed the agreements in 2008. That meant, when they went to Parliament, it was going to be an up or down vote.
Right.
They couldn't reopen the text. And of course, we got the vote. The Obama administration chose to let the lawyers run the negotiation. With apologies to any lawyers in the room. Do signal who you are so we can deal with you later.
Put your hands up, please.
If you hand it to the lawyers rather than the policy people, you are going to get a purely legalistic. Our lawyers concluded that the agreement should not be signed before it goes to Parliament. And that was
ignored.
That was the end of it.
Oh, you mean in 2011 they decided that? Yeah.
In 2011, it went up as an open text.
Right.
And no parliamentarian, no congressman, for God's sake, is going to take the responsibility for not being 150 degrees nationalistic. So I have to conclude the Obama administration deliberately sabotaged it and then tried to turn it on the Iraqis. Now, are the Iraqis to blame? Yes, for almost everything. We were in it together, though.
In the report, and I recommend to you the Ryan's task force's report on the future of Iraq and an American policy toward Iraq. You just have to Google Atlantic Council Iraq Task Force, and it'll come up. In the task force report, you emphasize the continuing need to engage with Iraq because of the importance of Iraq. But there were a couple of questions that came from the audience that called that into question. One of them that I have right in front of me: how will the U.S. increase in oil and gas production and exporting affect the Middle East. So there is a kind of a counter narrative that says the United States is getting energy sufficient, maybe not energy independent, but we are meeting more of our own energy needs. So why do we really need to care about this stuff? Why do we need to pay the price that we've paid to be so involved?
Well, I think that is an issue on several levels. It's absolutely a legitimate question. The answer to that is probably we don't need to be involved if you're going to take a purely Fortress America viewpoint. Our Asian and European allies do depend heavily on Middle Eastern oil, Iraq and indeed Saudi Arabia. So I would suggest to you, if you continue to think of the U.S. as a global power, then you need to think in global terms, not just what's good for us, but what's good for our traditional allies. Parenthetically, I would note that beginning with the Obama administration, continuing now with the Trump administration, there has been a sharp move away from the traditional post-World War II order in the Middle East and elsewhere, in which the U.S. led. The U.S. is not leading now, but again, it's the Middle East that you know so well. The scorpion and the fox, remember that? Yeah. A fox and a scorpion are on the bank of a river, figuring out how to get across. The scorpion proposes that the fox carry him on his back. The fox says, "But you'll sting me and you'll kill me." And the scorpion said, "No, because then I'd die too." Midstream, the scorpion stings the fox, and as the fox goes down, he says, "Why?" And the scorpion, "Because it's the Middle East."
Well, that's... on that note, good night. No, but we know people in the Middle East are not irrational. I mean, everything we heard from the panel that was up here before was that there are incentives for Iraqi parties to act in ways that might lead to instability because they have specific interests. Now, in the task force report, you emphasize that governance is extremely important. And Ambassador Faley did the same thing. You know, if you don't have people seeing some kind of benefit, even just basic security and stability, which in some parts of southern Iraq are vastly improved, right? But you don't see electricity, you don't see the oil money filter down, right? You said in the report 1 in 5 Iraqis lives in poverty. It's 20% of the population of what has historically been a rich oil state that not only is a rich oil state, but also has a substantial agricultural base. And for a while, before the last decades of turmoil, maybe the best educated population in the Arab world. So it's not that these people are irrationally going at each other, right? So how we heard from the panel some of the challenges on governance. How did you and the task force think that governance could be improved, and what outsiders like the United States could do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're about 100 years into the modern Middle East,
right,
which arose out of World War I. There is one consistency if you look at that whole period. I call it the failure of isms, failure of governance. And it starts from the beginning, the establishment of the French and British mandates in the old Ottoman Middle East. So from that day to this, you had imperialism, colonialism, monarchism in core countries like Egypt and Iraq, as well as in Jordan and Libya. You had militarism, Arab nationalism, personified by Gamal Abdel Nasser, Baathism in Iraq and Syria, Arab socialism, communism in South Yemen. They all had one thing in common. They failed to govern. And that is what will produce the ultimate defeat of Islamic State. They too failed to govern, with a lot of pressure from us to make sure they didn't. So militarily defeating the Islamic State is not going to settle anything in Iraq or anywhere else. Only the development of political structures, institutions, as Rod said, is going to do that. And it is going to be an extremely heavy lift. So what if we say we're not going to do it? Well, the Obama administration talked about the pivot to Asia. If you look at that in anthropomorphic terms, when you do it, you're exposing your backside to the Middle East, which will take a great, big, nasty bite out of it. We've seen what happened in countries like Afghanistan when we decided our work here is done, like after the defeat of the Soviets in 1989. So we decided we were done too. Even though we could see the Civil War coming as the Mujahideen factions united only to oppose the Soviets would turn on each other, all perfectly predictable, and that's what happened. Then you saw the rise of the Taliban. The Pakistanis got behind that because they did not want a nasty civil war on their own unstable borders. The Taliban brought in Al-Qaeda, and that was the road to 9/11. Interestingly, in my view, the only significant foreign policy mistake the Bush 41 administration made, and it would have been very difficult to foresee what came. I stress this in part because our greatest setbacks have come not from our advances into the region, but from our withdrawals from it. And that is what we are on the cusp of with Iraq. The space that we and our coalition controlled or influenced when I left Iraq in early 2009 is now held by a diminishing Islamic State in the north and west and by Iranian-backed Shia militias in the center and the south. That is hardly a step forward for American policy interests. With a new administration, you have the opportunity for a relook. But again, I would not hold my breath.
So we've had two transitional elections, 08 and 16, in which the candidate who won basically said we should get out of the Middle East. So how do you sell this to the American people? Because obviously there's a weariness about our involvement. And when you talk about it's a long game to help build these institutions, I think a lot of Americans think we've already been in the Middle East for a long time, right? And we've paid a heavy price. So the argument that we've been there a long time, so we should stay longer, doesn't seem to resonate at the electoral level. And I'm just wondering how would you convince the average voter that we have both an economic and a military security interest in this part of the world when we're producing so much more oil and these folks just don't seem to be able to get their act together?
Well, it starts by leadership. Both the current and the former administration might want to write that down. The use of the bully pulpit. What we had, I think, certainly in the Obama years, was a version of, oh, please tell me where my people are going so I can lead them. I thought personally that one mistake the 43 administration made after 9/11 was not putting the country on a war footing. What that did was to make this the province of our all-volunteer military, basically 1% of the population, and nobody else had to worry about it. Look, I know about being tired. I have spent 7 years of my life after 9/11 between Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Both in the early going in Afghanistan, opening the embassy at the end of 2001, and then coming back as ambassador, the same thing in Iraq. So yeah, I know about being tired. But I also know that if we follow a customary American pattern to say, we're done here, it's not our problem, it's somebody else's, that's exactly what our adversaries count on, and it's exactly what our allies fear. So again, it's a much broader issue right now for this administration than Iraq, as important as that is. Is the United States going to continue to lead in the world, not dominating it, not handing out orders through consultation, shared interests, and so forth, or not. Because if we decide, really, this is just too hard and too expensive and too long, well, others will step forward. And it will not be to our benefit.
Some of the details in the task force report. You urge the United States to take a role in trying to mediate between the Kurdish regional government and Baghdad to establish a stable relationship between the two. I take it, and I think that it's, if not explicitly between the lines in the task force report, that means that you wouldn't encourage Kurdish independence no matter what the referendum result is. You wouldn't encourage the United States to support that you think that the maintenance of a decentralized Kurdish area but within a unified federal Iraq is what the U.S. should shoot for. What kind of tools do we have between Erbil, the KRG, and Baghdad, and what should be our end state in trying to bring them together? What would be the American preferred result?
God, if that's what you got out of the report, we miswrote it.
Well, I'm sorry.
The point we were trying to make, or at least I was that, look, the days of the United States telling the Kurds what they should or should not do with their future are over. When I was there, we certainly did do that. And it was along the lines of, don't do something that could take the wheels off the bus and get folks killed. We don't have that kind of skin in the game anymore. So yes, the relationships between Erbil and Baghdad are very important. We need to see what we can do at the request of both parties to help them find a way forward that will enhance stability and security throughout the country.
But what if we get a referendum, an overwhelming vote in favor of pursuit of independence by the Kurdish government in the KRG? Is that something the U.S. should try to help them achieve through negotiations with Baghdad?
If that is the overwhelming wish of the Kurdish people, I think it would have to be respected. We would then have to see what practical role we could play to see that things come to an end game that enhances security throughout the territory and isn't a threat to it. Can we do that? I don't know. But we are no longer in a position where we should be telling the Kurds or any other part of the Iraqi population just exactly what it is they need to do politically, in large part because we don't really know.
But we have interests there, and so how should we define our interests in Iraq?
Well, that goes back
because we're not there just for humanitarian purposes, right?
Well, certainly not, and that's
right.
the thrust of the report,
Right.
that we have vital national security interests in Iraq. We need to be present. We need to establish ourselves as a player. We need to be talking to everyone inside Iraq, and then, as Rod and others said, in the region. This is a critical time for the region. But again, I can tell you, if we're not prepared to play that leadership role in Iraq or more broadly in the region, others will. And it is not going to take us to a happy place.
So the United States presumably has an interest in reducing Iranian influence in Iraq. How high should that be in our priority list versus kind of the encouragement of stability, which, let's face it, if you're going to try to drive Iranian influence down, that would mean the Iranians would have enormous incentive to try to destabilize Iraq.
These are all good points. First, going back to you mentioned the JCPOA. I thought it was a pretty good arms control agreement, but that's all it is. I mean, it's not a treaty of peace and friendship. In the Reagan years, we negotiated some pretty good arms control agreements with the Soviets. That didn't stop President Reagan from referring to them as the evil empire. But we unfortunately created the view in the largely Arab Middle East, that we were shifting our strategic focus from the Arabs to Iran. And that's how you get things like the Saudi decision to start an air war in Yemen without consulting us in advance. So, absolutely the wrong thing to do. I do think it's a pretty good agreement, but we need to conduct the oversight of our policies in a way that will, in conjunction with our allies, that will shove back on Iran, because the broad impression in the region is that President Obama was taking us in the other direction, into a period of friendship with Iran. I would just say one more thing on that. It illustrates how hard this stuff is, and also how important it is to know history both broadly and narrowly. Trudy mentioned Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force.
An old friend of yours.
Yes, we go back a ways together. So who is Qasem Soleimani? Well, he was commissioned in the Iranian army summer of 1980, a month or two before the Iraqis invaded Iran. He spent about 7 years of that 8-year war as an infantry officer on the front. At one point, when he was still in his 20s, his late 20s, he was made acting division commander because everybody above him was dead. So do you think Qasem Soleimani remembers the Iran-Iraq war when he looks at Iraq today? Yeah, you bet your ass he does. So what's most important to someone like Soleimani? That Iraq, under any governance conceivable, can never again threaten the national security and indeed the existence of Iran. Now, we don't get that because we don't really remember that there ever was an Iran-Iraq war. But the folks who are on both sides of it will remember as long as they're alive. So that means it's going to be pretty hard to find common ground with Soleimani and what he represents in Iraq. Oddly, there was a moment right after 9/11 when Soleimani was rethinking what might be possible with the United States. And I was doing some discreet negotiations with the Iranians at that time about Afghanistan. And then came State of the Union 2002, Axis of Evil.
Right.
Anytime you're awakened between the hours, say, of midnight and 6, 100% of the time, it's not going to be good news. Right. So my staff shook me awake in Kabul saying, boss, you're really not going to like this. Well, it killed that channel. And interestingly, we were in a fairly detailed negotiation with the Iranians. My counterpart was the Iranian ambassador to Kabul, and I had just opened the embassy, on the rendition of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
The head of one of the more brutal Afghan militias.
Right. The Iranians didn't like him much either. They had him under house arrest, and we were just figuring out the modalities here. How could they do this? And it looked like they would give him to the Afghan Interim Authority, who would then give him to us. So what they did in response, the Iranian ambassador was good enough to actually tell me, is they put him across the border into Afghan Baluchistan one night. We launched immediately, discovered that, yes, indeed they had, and he was gone. He finally came in from the cold earlier this year. So how many American troopers did Hekmatyar and his party kill that might have lived if some folks didn't feel like playing cowboy and sticking it to the Iranians? These are the kind of interesting moral questions that never really get asked, let alone answered.
Let me conclude with a question about your reflection on the future of Iraq. Obviously, you wouldn't have have taken part in this task force. You wouldn't have headed up this task force if you thought that there was no hope for Iraq. So what do you see as the more kind of optimistic elements that make you think that an American engagement with Iraq could pay dividends in the creation, by playing a long game, of a stable and relatively prosperous Iraq?
Well, it would start, I think, with a set of statements not unlike those President Trump made about Afghanistan. It was a long, painful process to get there, as it should be in a democracy when you're talking about use of force and the lives of Americans. But I think the president put us in a good place in Afghanistan, mainly by making it about conditions, not calendars. And here is a case where I think President Obama actually prepped the battlefield pretty well for President Trump when he halted the troop withdrawal. So it would be that kind of policy statement made after close consultations with Iraqi political leaders of all parties and with our traditional regional allies, so that you would launch a policy that had significant buy-in and backing both within Iraq and around Iraq. I think that kind of cohesive approach is absolutely critical. Is it going to work? Yeah, who knows? But it's definitely worth the effort, and in so doing, for the administration to make it clear that it is a long game, that these things don't happen overnight, and that it requires sustained U.S. leadership, again, in consultation with regional and Iraqi allies. I think what Ambassador Faley laid out would be a terrific script to start with for an inter-Iraqi discussion.
Mm-hmm. So you've been extremely patient. I want to thank all of you for the questions, which form the basis for most of my questions from about 45 minutes to an hour ago for our panel and for Ambassador Crocker. I'd also like to thank the Scowcroft Institute for International Affairs here at the Bush School, its director, Andrew Natsios, the staff there, Shira Helms, who Rod thanked, who put together a lot of the logistics of this, Leslie Rule, who is part of that staff, who just came on. I want to thank them. I want to thank you for your patience and your participation. And I want to ask you to join me in one final time to thank Ambassador Crocker and the other members of our panel.
Nicely done.
Thank you, sir.